So I'm going to throw a bowl, and when I throw the bowl, when I'm done throwing it, it by itself is really just how I would think a painter would think of a gessoed white canvas. It's what I'm going to put into it that is the actual energy that I want to convey. So the bowl itself is just this form. But then I'm going to go into it and bump it and move it and use my hands to create kind of a topographical trail, if you will. And that will be, that's what the bowl is about. It's that kind of analogy to body, to landscape, and the emotions and experience that kind of conveys to the viewer. So I'm going to start this again. I'm going to use a smaller bat on this one. And I'm using about 15 pounds of clay. This is a porcelain. The way I think of these, the bowl is a form that is, it's functional, it has a utilitarian past. But every culture that's ever made them has also explored the metaphorical, either through form or decoration, painting, how they put image and narrative into the inside of the bowl, that space, that beautiful enclosed kind of volume that a bowl has the potential to express. It's a very powerful space. Back in the 90s, I had the opportunity to work on the island of Fayal in the Azores, and there was a volcano at one end of the island, and it was almost a perfect bowl. It was just ash, and the scale was such, it was a small volcano crater. And the scale was such that you could actually walk down into it and walk around the perimeter of that bowl. I spent 2 days in there just walking and feeling that space, and it had a profound effect on me in understanding kind of the power of that containment in a physical way, in a human way, not intellectual, but one that's felt. So kind of when I was walking in there, it's like I'm the tip of the paintbrush that someone's painting an image or a decoration on that curved rim. And when you're walking on a curve, your body feels that, and as you leave a trail of your footsteps, the memory of your path is left. In the exact same way as a brush glides over, from the center of the bowl up to the rim and back down again, how that curve expresses that line. Well, it's the same thing with your body when you're walking in that kind of a volume. So anyway, so that was kind of profound for me. And then up in the, 2000s, early 2000s, sometime in there, I taught up at Anderson Ranch in Aspen, in Snowmass. And I flew in from Denver, and I came in over the Rockies. And as you come in, you're flying actually very close to the top of the mountains. And when you're up at that level, what you see is not what you see from the highway. You're above timberline, so it's all just landscape, no vegetation, no growth. And you just see the rolling topography of that landscape, and you see the rock formations. You see how that land moves and undulates, but what you also see is how it collects water, because at that altitude, snow melts and then it drains, and it forms all these little lakes. And as I flew over that, I had all these ideas about bowls, about defining the topography of that landscape. So that's where these bowls come from. I think of them as landscapes and topography, both of the body, but also of the exterior world. So when I'm throwing this, I want a nice flat skin. I don't want memory of the throwing lines on it. So, because I want it to, when it's done, I want the curves and the fluctuations in the form to feel like, the arm, the divot between a muscle. I want it to feel like flesh. I also want it to feel like those beautiful landscapes when you have vegetation, just a soft vegetation growing on an undulating topography. It's like you see this in Iowa and Nebraska when you're going through corn country, and corn is like healthy and full growth, and you see these beautiful undulating landscapes. When I was up at Archie Bray Foundation in the 70s working, the hills outside of Helena were in this absolutely gorgeous growth. And it had this low vegetation, and it just covered the hills, and it was just so soft and sexy moving across that landscape. So when I'm throwing, I want a nice tight skin so that as I bend it and form it, that those curves really pop out and are very soft and undulating. I don't want the memory of that finger pull in there. It's a language that doesn't belong in this type of a pot. So I have to spend time at the beginning to make sure that I pull all those out, compress the heck out of them. So now we begin to open. And this is the tricky part, because this is when you can lose it. It's just a lot of small moves. If you do it too quick, you lose the strength of the clay that holds up the vertical. If I expand the bottom too fast, then I lose that. So I have to be careful. All the while, I have to compress it. Just keep compressing it. It's the tightness of the skin that'll hold it. So a lot of the times, the way I open is I open from the top down, not from the bottom up. And that's so that the arch that's holding the form up down in here will stay strong. If I widen that too soon, then it can't handle the weight on top of it and can collapse. So when I threw this, I purposely kept it a bit thick so that the rim could thin out as I pull it out. If you leave the top too thin, then you tear the rim as you drive it outwards in space. So when I make these bowls, I wedge up a pile of clay, and I usually do these in series of, depending on the scale, 4 to 6. I make them in different scales, different pounds. This is 15 pounds. I've made them up to 30 pounds and down to about 3. You know, what's interesting about how your mind works is as there are different scales, the analogies shift. And And by that I simply mean that how your memory triggers, the larger the scale, the more your memory brings it into kind of a felt experience. The smaller the scale, the more it is kind of into an intellectual connection. So I'm interested in kind of what that's all about and how memory is triggered in people and how an object can do that. At some point here, I'm going to stop and let it set up for a few hours and go back at it. And the reason for that is just let the skin set up so that I can bring it farther out in circumference. Basically having it kind of maintain structural strength so we don't get a collapse. Drawing has always been kind of a critical part of my studio practice. It's how I think, and it happened. You know, it's interesting how you identify something that's important from your kind of experiences that you just kind of take for granted. You know, so back in the early '80s. I had a studio in Guilford, Connecticut with my sister-in-law, Jane Gustin. And she was, back then, she was kind of a painter-potter. And she'd make this Mayolica ware, and then she'd do all these just wonderful drawings on the Mayolica. And, you know, I'm making pots. I'm out of grad school and trying to figure out, you know, what I want to make and how to make it, and, you know, how I want to be in the world as a potter, all that stuff. And, you know, my ideas are triggering my studio work. And so I get a group of ideas for teapots, say, and then I'll make a whole series. And then I'll get a group of ideas for vases, and I'll make a whole series. And so, but as I'm doing all this, I'm doodling. And one day we were at a little diner for lunch, and I'm sitting there doodling on a napkin, and I'm just drawing these teapot kind of kettle type forms that I was making in the very late '70s, early '80s, and I'm doodling them on a napkin, and Jane looks across from me from the table, and she goes, "What are you doing?" I said, "Oh, I'm drawing my teapots." And she goes, "Let me see." And she takes a napkin. She goes, "No, you're not." I go, "What do you mean I'm not?" She goes, "These don't look anything like your teapots." I go, "Well, yeah, they do." And she goes, "No, they don't. Look at them." And I started looking at them, and what I realized that they really didn't look anything like what I was making. They had a very different sense of energy in it. They might have had you know, the shape might have been the same, or the, you know, how one line met another line might have been the same, you know, when you think of silhouette. But what she was talking about is that there was an energy and exuberance in the drawings that was lacking in the pots. And it was like this aha moment of just waking up and going, "Oh my God, you know, I think I know what I'm doing. I don't know what I'm doing at all." So I then began to doodle all the time, and then started to look at the doodles and pin them on the wall, and then try to work from there. And that practice of taking this little throwaway thing, you just draw this stupid little shape on a napkin or a piece of paper, and you know, you can fill it up. You can make hundreds of them, and they're inconsequential. They mean nothing. And yet on some level, they mean everything. And so I started to do that. I started doing all these doodles on paper, and I'd get newsprint, and I'd roll out rolls of newsprint. I'd go down to the newspaper and get their end rolls.
and just roll them out. I have a big, long studio space. It's a big old chicken coop, and so it's a bit narrow and long. And I'd roll out 30, 40 feet of it, and then I'd just get India ink and brushes and just dip the brush in the ink and just start doodling shapes, doodling forms. So if I'm making vases, I'm doodling vases. I'm making teapots, I'm doing teapots. And I'll draw like 200 or 300 of them. And then what I'd do is I'd cut out sections of it and pin them to the wall. And I could see this huge amount of energy of this one thinking process surrounding me. So before I ever even went into the clay, before I even wedged the first ball of clay, my studio was filled with a couple hundred pots, all kind of directing me to a way of thinking. And man, I did that for years and years and years. Excuse me. And so the idea of that, just putting something on paper to just get it out of your brain and then respond to it became really important. So drawing's always been a factor for me, and I like to think of them as doodles. That word has a different kind of weight to it than drawing. I never really showed them to anybody. I had a retrospective a few years ago, and from there, I put some of them in. And it was interesting to do that because, again, they're not meant as a finished project. They're meant as kind of a synapse, as like a trigger. Here's a little moment, think about this, and then let's move on. And but they're critical to my work. In 2010, I started doing some serious drawings with charcoal and graphite, and that was important, big drawings, and that was important because those drawings were riffing off the big vessels I was making at that time. So I'd make these big pots, and then I'd go upstairs, and I've got this nice kind of clean space upstairs that I turned into a drawing studio for that period of time, and I just laid out tables, and I got big reams of paper, big sheets of paper, and I started just doing graphite and charcoal drawings on them, and I started to find that the drawings started to feed into the work, and the work fed into the drawings, and it was really nice. I did it for 3-4 months, and made about 20 drawings. I haven't done that since, not so much because I haven't been interested, but I haven't really had the time to do it. To take away that amount of time from the regular studio practice, and again, that's simply because of schedules and that kind of thing. But I tend to focus on it's like when I go into something, I go into it. So I can't do a drawing in the morning and go in the studio and work in clay in the afternoon. My mind doesn't work like that. I have to kind of sink deep. So where I am now, I'm doing these little doodles of the cloud series, and again, trying to just understand kind of proportion and ratio and relationship, and how these objects kind of work, and then kind of work very abstractly off of that. But drawing is one of those things that so many people discount, and I think it's incredibly important, and it's been really valuable for what I do. One of the wonderful things about ceramics is the millions, of techniques possible that someone can use to make objects. The history of our field is just full of invention, and every culture in the world has come up with ways of making things in clay, and they have, from the most raw, rudimentary types of forming methods and firing methods to the most advanced, and we each have it in our decision making. It's like for the things I want to make, how do I realize that? What methods do I use to realize that vision? And, that's what school is about, is trying to show you all these different opportunities and possibilities within the field. You got everything from, just pinch pots and that type of thing, and digging a hole in the ground, so throwing some wood on top of your work and burning it, and you've got that, to like space age technology in kilns, 3D printing, rapid prototyping, that type of thing. And that's fascinating. I find that really intriguing. And so technique is one of those things that we all have to find our own door in. What's the best methods to use to realize the idea? And my technique, what I've used over the years, has really been idea driven. I mean, when I make objects, I have an idea in my mind of what I want to make. I have a vision. I have a point of view, and so the way I touch the clay, and whether I throw or hand build or whatever, comes from trying to realize that vision. So early in the work, it was throwing, and then the ideas kind of led to asymmetry, and asymmetry led to coil building, and that decision wasn't based on, I think I want to coil build. I hated coil building. I didn't want anything to do with it. I hated hand building. I mean, when I was in undergrad school, I wouldn't do it. They gave hand building assignments, and I refused. Drove George Timmock nuts, and that kind of specificity, the dogma, to like, I won't do this. It really inhibited me for years. It was the stupidity of youth, that arrogance. And but boy, once I started to make some drawings, and I couldn't figure out how to make it on the wheel, and I had to figure out how to hand build to make it. I wanted to hand build really badly. So for me, the door into something is the idea, and then I got to work backwards from that. And that comes in forming processes, but it also comes in firing methodologies. We deal with rules a lot. You need to throw a pot like this, or this is how you throw, or this is how you roll a coil, or this is how you hand build. And all that's kind of bullshit. It's all those rules are there for a reason. They're really there so that the school's facility isn't like destroyed, and that teachers can go home on the weekend, and you fire the kiln this long because you have another kid coming behind you who wants to load it, and instead of a 3-day cool, you do an 8-hour cool. There's reasons why we do things, and if you kind of peel away the onion skin there, you find out that none of them have to do with ceramics. Very few. They have to do with all these other outside perceptions or realities that we have to deal with. Like, I fire my kiln this long because I got to go pick up my kid from school in the afternoon, so I wanted to fire off first, early. It's those types of decisions. And it has nothing to do with thinking of how glazes melt or the time it takes to mature something in heat. It doesn't, the cooling of a kiln is decided upon schedule rather than on maybe how crystal formation is formed in a cooling cycle. And I found out early in my career when I was up at Alfred, getting ready for my grad show, this is when Chinos were brand new, and I developed this Chino, Gustin Chino, and it's around now and it's all over the place. But I was trying to figure out the glaze back then, and I would fire at night, and I'd do all my reducing cycles at night, so I could really see the flame coming out of the kiln, and the color and the length of the flame and the whole thing, which was the guide to the color. once the kiln cooled. And right before my end of the thesis, right before I was about to present thesis and set up my exhibition, I had one last kiln to fire, and it was all Shino pots. And I loaded the kiln and fired it. But I had, because of the schedule, I had to fire during the day, and I couldn't quite tell the color of the flame. And I ended up oxidizing the kiln. And so I opened the kiln, and every damn pot in there is white instead of orange. And I freaked out. I mean, I was really upset, and I thought I destroyed, I ruined my show. And because some of the best spots I had were in that firing. And so I just go to the bar, the local bar up at Alfred, and I just get rip-roaring drunk and really, really upset. And then I go back, to the kiln later that evening, I guess, and still not feeling great, obviously. And I unload the thing, and the next day I look at the pots, and it was the next day that I realized that these were good pots, and I had an expectation of outcome, and my being upset had to do that I didn't meet the expectation. I wasn't looking at what was sitting in front of me, and I'm so glad that happened. That was like one of these little life lessons that you're thrown every once in a while, and you could just miss it so easily. You could just walk by that one and not realize what gift was given you. And from that day on, I started using Shinos, both in reducing and oxidizing atmospheres. And I started to realize the kiln was a tool that I could use. So length of fire, length of cooling, all these cycles, when I reduced, when I oxidized, I really started to play with. And with very few glazes, I got, if I used 4 or 5 glazes, it looked like I had 20 different glazes. And I've used that all the way along. So technique is one of these things, how you use process. It's all open-ended, and it really has to do with your ability to actually see what's in front of you, and not be wedded to outcome. And if you can do that, I think the decision making and how you use the material and how you use the process available to us can get expansive very quickly within a very tight construct. I mean, you have a kiln, you have temperature, you have atmosphere, you've got this clay that you're building something around. It's pretty tight what those boundaries are, and yet there's so much room for invention within it. But you can't be you can't be nailed down to outcome, because if you are, then if it doesn't meet it, it fails, and you don't see what actually happened. And this happens a lot in wood firing. I can't tell you how many times we unload kilns and somebody is so upset that their work came out the way it did, and there's a group of us looking at the work, and we're going, what's going on here? This is kind of nice. They're not seeing it. And why aren't they seeing it? They're not seeing it because they had an idea of what they wanted, and it didn't meet that. But oftentimes, if you are asked to look at something differently, you are your viewpoint expands. And in my work, I'm just always trying to figure that out. I'm always trying to rattle the cage a bit so my viewpoint expands. It's so easy to get wedded into this, I want it to be like this attitude. And I find that is just, it can bite you if you're not careful. So that's why I kind of purposely put my work in situations that struggle is part of the end result of it. And, and sometimes the work sucks. It's just, it's not so good. Oh, that didn't work. But even in the bad work, I had a crit once with Ferguson. This was after I graduated school, and he came to out east and he visited my studio, and he talked to me about my work. And he told me to take the worst pots and put them on the shelves and live with them. Live with the failure. And that was really great advice, because it really forced me to, instead of discard something and walk away from it and then kind of get it out of my mind and not think about it anymore, I had to kind of live with it and look at it and ask questions. You can't help it if you see something ugly sitting in your space. You know, it does piss you off a little bit. And but there's also there's some learning in there, and it's not just about what not to make, but how can you use what's there? What's the good part of it? You know, and I do that a lot. I live with my work a lot. I have it in the studio. I have it up in the gallery area. You know, I think it's important to kind of put it out there to view, so I'm aware of it. You know, it's not just when it comes out of the kiln and it's shipped someplace and then it's gone. And it still stuns me sometimes. You know, when you get something that is kind of remarkable, you kind of can't believe that your hand was in that. And that is like, what an amazing feeling that is. You know, and I think that is one of the wonders of ceramics, because you can have that feeling the first day you step into a clay studio and try and throw a pot. You know, the feeling's the same. Doesn't matter how far along you are in your career, or how good your work is, or anything like that. That feeling of accomplishment, of wonder, of you know, I made this. How great is that? You know, that's a powerful thing. It's why students who take ceramics 1, many move on to ceramics 2, because they're in it. They see, they recognize the power of success, and that power of success is weighed against the power of failure, and failure is really important, and failure is critical in ceramics. You know, fire kilns that don't work. You screw up on this, you screw up on that. You know, that pot didn't work. You know, you learn from that. And I think technique and how you approach technique, you know, in the large sense of what that word means, is an interesting thing to ponder and to ask questions about. So I try to do that, and I try to set up situations where I have to struggle with the techniques I know. And out of that struggle, always comes something that you know, a light bulb goes off and it takes me into the next move. Let me talk a bit about kind of the cloud series and how this all came about. In 2014, I was invited with my wife, Nancy Train Smith, to go up to Archie Bray Foundation up in Helena, Montana. And we went up there and spent about, I don't know, a month making work in the Maine studio. And what's interesting when you go someplace to work, you have, you know, it's like you can't, if you take your own studio with you, you're just going to another place, and then you're just making what you make. And I'm really not interested in that. I'm interested, if I do go someplace, I want to be able to ask a question I hadn't asked, or to put myself in a situation where I kind of have to struggle. And I'll talk about the idea of struggle in another conversation, but so when I went up to the Bray, I wanted to say, okay, well, what do I want to do? So I talk about this a little bit in my lecture. I think of my work. One of the ways I think of my work is that it moves from A to B to C to D. It's fairly linear. It always has been. It's the way my mind works. It's like I make something, I look at it, I respond to it, and I make the next thing. The work always kind of leads itself. Obviously, the things I think about and feel and you know, all of that's in the work, and I kind of trust that it comes out. I lead it in different directions at various times, but how I actually make significant moves in my work over the years has been the fact that I take it to a certain point, and then I hit this moment of struggle. and then I have to figure it out. And usually the way I figure it out is I just change something. I just take one little thing in the work that I kind of keep repeating, and I change it. So I make that happen through going through the formal door. Okay, so let's say, I'm working on a vertical scale, and everything, the center of gravity is at one part of a piece, and I look over a period of time, and the center of the gravity is always kind of in the same place, and I'll go, okay, I'm going to shift the center of gravity. So instead of it being high, I'll make it low. Instead of low, I'll make it high, and then everything changes in the work. It's just you get different forms, and you get different ideas based on those forms. And those forms actually take you to different places of analogy. So this is what I do. So I went up to the Bray. I thought, okay, instead of working on a circle, I'll work on an oval. And then that just changed everything. And it just allowed the forms to kind of morph in a different sense of direction. When I came back from the Bray, I started building these pieces in the studio, and they got bigger and bigger and bigger. And then from there, they lost the sense of interior, or not the sense of interior. They lost the vessel. The pieces asked to be enclosed. They didn't want to have a neck on them. They didn't want to be kind of a pot. They wanted to be a sculpture, and so I just kind of let that happen, and which was actually a pretty difficult thing to do, because I've been making pots for God knows the entire length of my studio career, and so this was kind of a big move. But so then I do a whole series of these cloud pieces, and then I get to this point and I go, okay, well, I want to bring these cloud pieces back into vessels. So how do I do that? So now I have to get entrance into them again. I have to give them some way to get into the pot. The air can either enter or be released. And so these cloud jars came out of that, and that's how they started. And so again, it was asking a formal question, just saying, well, instead of enclosing it, I'm not going to enclose it, and now they're going to be vessels again. And so how do I do that? So that was the investigation, and I started making them in about 2017, 2018, I guess. And I haven't made a whole lot of them. I've probably made a dozen over that period of time, maybe a little bit more. But they all, again, lead one thing to another. And so the one I'm doing for the demo, I'm working on two. I'm going to work on two. And they'll kind of riff off each other, and then from there they'll take their own kind of identity. One of the things, I was down in Mexico in January and early February on the Yucatan. I was looking at a lot of Mayan pottery, and I was really interested in this one kind of form of this vessel that the Mayans made, and there were these beautiful kind of wide open pots. They come up like that, and then they have this like beautiful rim on it, and the language in the pot is completely different than the language on the rim. And I was interested in that dichotomy. So anyway, so in these pieces, I'm going to be working on different rims, different entrances, different necks, however you want to describe that, and So these are new for me. So this is kind of, I'm intrigued by that. One of the things I've thought a lot about over the years, and has been instrumental in kind of the early development of my work, and kind of how it's transitioned to where it is now, has been kind of wrapping my mind around the construct of time and how time is used, how you participate in it in your work. How much time do you spend on something? What are the variables that contribute to the way you work, or the variables that prohibit you from working? And very early on in my career, I realized, I came out of the studio production, the 70s. It was like I went to school to learn how to be a potter, and my vision at that time in the 70s was to settle in and build a studio and make pots and sell them. That's what I wanted to do. And there's something in that process of like kind of having this dream and trying to then realize it. It's an interesting process because you hit these walls along the way, and you have to decide what, is your dream the right dream, or is it, the wrong dream? And I kind of, I was coming up at a time period in the late 70s, early 80s where ceramics was just changing rapidly. The conversations around clay and what pots were and all of that. And I got really intrigued with that. When I first started the studio, I worked my butt off for months, and I had the first Christmas sale, and it's a 4-day sale, and I made $10. And that was like a it was a kind of a heavy moment, where reality kind of smacks you in the forehead. And I was making good pots. It was just, they weren't the pots that the people around where I lived wanted to have. There was already a sense of the type of pottery that was being made in that area and being shown in that area. And, my pots weren't it. I had a completely different aesthetic. And so the people in that area were educated to a certain sense of form and color and decoration, and mine was just left field. So, I had a reality smack, and that was incredibly freeing on a lot of levels. I was also incredibly lucky because right as this is happening, I got an NEA grant, and at the time it was $7,500. So this is early this is 77, 78, and $7,500 at that point in time, that I could live a year off of that. Easy. Studio bills, everything, apartment, food, gas, all of that. And so it was incredibly freeing in the studio. So I figured out that the idea of working rapidly on something and make a body of work that all speak to each other was something that I really wasn't very good at. And I also, it wasn't that I could technically do it, but my interest wasn't in doing it. And I found that out by trying. You have to try this stuff to figure out if it works for you. I found out it did, and I found out that the longer I spent on a piece making it, the better the piece was, and the more curious I became. So the element of time, which I kind of started with this conversation, played a factor in how my work moved through the late 70s into the early 80s. I just needed to spend more time with what I was making. And that is not just in the making of the object, that is in making a series of objects or exploring a series of ideas, or exploring a single idea through a series of objects. So I was never good at making 6 of this and 6 of that and 6 of that. Make a dozen bowls, make a dozen teapots, make a dozen jars. I could never do it. It was like when I was making the teapots, I was still involved with the bowls. When I was making the bowls, I was involved with the jars. It was in my head. I just realized that that was not for me, and so I had to make the change. And the change was just lengthen the time frame of my engagement with the things that were in front of me that I was working on. So if I made platters, I made 100 platters, and it took me 3 months to make them. I just threw platters. I threw 8 a day, and trimmed them, and it was like I could go through a series of platters, 8 to 10, over a period of a week or two, and then I'd start again, and then I'd start again, and over that period of time, I'd make 100. And then I'd glaze 100. I'd stack them up and then glaze them all at the same time. By the same time, I went through cycles. So I'd glaze 8 for a kiln, fire the kiln, see what they came out, fire another 8, and just do it that way. And that worked for me, and that has worked for me ever since. And so when I build work, when I make work, the element of time is very important. And when outside world interferes with that, I figured out all kinds of strategies to lengthen the time period that you can make work. So I could go away for a month, and I figured out how to keep pieces wet and damp and ready to go. So when I come back, I can just, again, jump right back in and just pick up the conversation, and that's what it feels like. It's like, oh, this is an old friend. We've had a conversation. Time has gone by. Let's revisit that. And you just get right back into it. So the element of time is one I think about, and I think it's an important thing for other people to think about too, or at least to ask questions about. When I'm talking to young artists and kind of what they're struggling with, and how they're getting along in the world and their studio practice and everything else, one of the things I always ask them is kind of how they think about time and how they think about their relationship to the objects they're making. And then if there's a question in there that I sense, then I'll dig a little deeper and try to propose kind of strategies they might use to screw around with that a little bit. But I think everybody's sense of that is different, and I think what's important is to try to find your own. But mine has simply been to spend as much time as necessary on a piece until it's done, and that could be months, or it could be days. It depends on the object. With T-bowls, it's literally minutes. Whiskey cups, the small stuff, it's very quick and fluid, because that's what that kind of object calls for me. But the bigger work just requires a different strategy. And I see people building big work, and they build it really quick. They can build huge pieces quickly. And I can't do it, I go slow, and I've just accepted that and have built kind of a world around me to allow that to happen. So when I'm struggling, that part of it isn't part of the struggle. The struggle is in ideas or kind of conceptualizing something and trying to make it real in front of you, and it not meeting what you're kind of imagining and trying to figure that out. But I refuse to struggle on the element of how I engage with the work, and the energy and time needed to do it. And so I push everything else aside to make that happen. So time is an important thing to think about, and your relationship to it in the studio, and the processes you use, and what the work is asking for in response. Sometimes it's so clear the work is asking for just a little more time. Spend a little more time with me. And sometimes the work is just like, God, go away. You're just killing this thing. So you have to be aware and aware of that conversation between object and your hand and your mind, and it's got to sync. And oftentimes one element of that triad could be out of whack, and you've got to bring it all back into focus. So it's something I think about, and I think it's important to talk about. bowl, porcelain bowl. I've made these probably since around 2007 or 8. And I make them in different scales. And I like to work with porcelain because I like how the glaze moves on that interior surface. They came out of flying over to Aspen one year to teach at Anderson Ranch and crossing the Rockies. And, you're above tree line when you cross over. I took a kind of like a small plane from Denver over to Aspen, and you come across the Rockies, and you're actually pretty low to the mountaintops when you come across. And the what's interesting, you don't see this when you're down driving through that landscape, but when you fly over it, the tree line ends, and the whole top of the mountains are bare, and there's beautiful topography. And you see these big kind of bowls forming where a peak comes up, but you have these movements coming down, and then down in the middle of it is a lake formed from all the snow melt. And I saw that topography as these big bowls. So I made a few up at Anderson Ranch, and then when I came home, I started really working on them. And over the years, I made quite a few of them, and I make them in different scales. And so I like I'm after the glaze kind of rolling through that topography, and I throw them, and then I punch them, and I bend them, and I do all that, and I create little finger dimples and marks, and I push them around a bit. But I think of all those as kind of like impositions in landscape. I see that as like, you got this beautiful field, and you have this boulder that comes out of the ground and sticks, but it's in the field, but it's not, the field could be full of weed or something, or, but then you have this little stone outcropping that everybody works around. And so that's how I think of it. It's just kind of topographical landscapes. So I'll make one of those, and I'll do. I'll make one. Usually I make them in series. I make 6 or 8 at a time, and then when I'm doing the drawings, I riff between one to the next, and that way, I'm kind of inventing mark making as I go. So I'll do one mark on one bowl, then I'll go, that's kind of interesting, and then I'll kind of try to figure that out a little bit more in the next bowl, and I'll go down the line. And out of that comes, some invention. And it's quiet, and it's not radical in a specific move, but over time, you get to places you wouldn't get to otherwise. And again, it's like one mark leads to another mark. They're responsive to each other. I think a lot of this stuff is like music, and where one note is responding to another note, and they have meaning because you're playing, they're working together, or they're pushing against each other. It's like dance, it's like movement. So that's what the bowls are. I'm going to make a group of tea bowls, whiskey cups, and every kiln I fire, I put a lot of them in. And I like the sense that the scale is, instead of being larger scale, it's really shrunk down to your hand. And so you experience it through your hand, you experience it through your lips. And I'm interested in this, at least in my situation, I work big most of the time. So to bring it down into kind of this really diminutive scale, it's hard. And your hands work differently, they touch differently. But also the world you're trying to create is different. It's a different sense of intimacy. And I enjoy that conversation between the large and the small. If all I did was that, I don't think I could do it. If all I did was large, I don't think I could do it. I have to move back and forth. I'm sitting inside the Anagama. My kiln is I basically built 3 chambers. So this is the first of 3. This is about 450 cubic feet. We have 25 people in this firing from all over New England, someone from Phoenix, and a couple people from New York. And we do this
twice a year, but with COVID, we had to delay a firing, so we're doing it in September instead of June. And this is pretty unique firing simply because of the COVID situation. We're having to schedule it very different. What usually takes 3 days to load is now going to be about 10 days, 10 to 12 days. And we just spread everything out so that we have very small groups of people on property at any given moment. They're all socially distanced, and we're just going to take our time doing something that usually is more frantic. We're going to start loading the first chamber first, and then the second chamber, which is the soda chamber, about 100 cubic feet, will be loaded. This is Saturday. We're going to start on a Tuesday. So we're going to start staggering the loadings. So again, to control the amount of people in any given time. This is going to be a little more difficult to load because we're only going to have one person in the kiln at a time. So there's going to be more moving around, more stretch breaks, that type of thing, more times to kind of take care of your old back. So everyone's delivered their work. They spent about a week delivering. And again, we did it so that only a few people showed up at a time to deliver work. So we didn't have large groups here. So it took about 5 days to deliver all the work. And it's all out on pallets outside. And we have a tent up and back for the second and third chambers. And they're pretty much full. So we're going to start loading soon. We're getting wadding ready. We're kind of organizing right now. And what I'll do is I'll video the whole inside of the kiln as we load, so everyone will get to see what's going on. If everything goes well and we get this thing filled, then we'll begin firing on the 21st, which is the following Monday. So a week from this coming Monday. So anyway, so this is an interesting time we're in, and we're having to accommodate the needs of that time, and we think we've figured it out, a way to do it. So you're all going to be kind of privy to that. It's a different world now, but I think there's certain things that are consistent in it, and these are the abstractions. My teacher, Ken Ferguson, at the Kansas City Art Institute, always used to just drive this thing home. He would just rattle this off at the moment's notice. It's like pots come from pots. And, he'd just scream that. And you got to make work. You got to make work, because if you don't make work, it isn't going to be made in your head. You have to make it real. You have to put your ideas into real space to try to understand them. And it doesn't matter if you're making a pot or sculpture, or you're doing conceptual art, or you're doing performance, or you're doing video, or whatever. You need to make something real that you can then respond to. And that really hit home quite deeply for me, because it asks so many other things. It asks you to be serious. It asks you to not only take your work seriously, but to take you seriously, take yourself seriously. That the energy put into something has value, and that you need to respect that. I was just, it would drive me nuts when I had students who would spend like a month working on something, and then it comes to that last moment of finishing it, and they would, when I say they, I mean, this didn't happen that often, but when someone did this, they'd make a decision that just totally diminished the amount of effort that went into the work, and almost as if nothing mattered. And the outcome was always bad, and it was like they just didn't have the thing to take it to the next, to just put that last bit of energy into it that they put all the way through. So commitment's really, it's so easy to say it, but it's really hard. And
And again, the idea of investing yourself in your work, you can say that, but what does that mean? I had a student who asked me if I would do a meeting with him out of my studio, and he was about to graduate, and he said he wanted to talk about some stuff he was thinking about doing. So I said, sure, come on out. And I'm in my studio and I'm looking out the window as this car drives in, and I see him get out of the car, and he comes over to this and knocks on my door, and he comes in, and we sit down and talk for about a half hour. And I go, okay, what do you want to do? What's your dream? And he goes through this whole thing about his dream. And it has to do with setting up a studio. He wanted to be in the same town as his family and everything. He didn't want to go to grad school. He just wanted to be a potter. And he wanted to have a little shop, and he wanted to sell the work, little gallery. All very wonderful things. And he goes, but the problem is I don't have any money. And so I sat there and I said, well, that's a problem. It's hard to do this stuff if you don't have an income source, or if you don't have that accessibility. And so then I kind of leaned over and looked out the window, and in the parking lot was a $20,000 cheap Jeep Cherokee. And so I just looked at him and I said, well, why don't you sell the Jeep and just get like a crappy little car, and then take the profit from the Jeep and go out and rent a space for a year and just pay the year's rent, and you'll have a certain amount of left over. And then with that, buy a used electric kiln, and then maybe buy a potter's wheel, and you could buy some lumber and build some tables and stuff, and then you can get going. And he looked at me like I was out of my mind. It's like, sell a Jeep? You got to be crazy, So that's what I'm talking about. It's like, it's like, what are you willing to do what you want, what you love to do? What are you willing to give up? Because you got to give up stuff. I mean, there's no doubt about it. You got to give up stuff. So my advice to young people, or to anybody who's doing this, is it's the commitment. And the commitment is about showing up. You got to show up to work. You got to show up to your studio. You got to show up to the act of making. You have to be invested in it. That's a good one. If you can do that, if you can come to terms with that, and all the dominoes that fall when you say you will do that, and accept that, and go through the good stuff and go through the bad stuff, and be willing to just be there in that commitment, then something's going to happen. You'll make a career out of it, and something good will come out of it. It always does. I've seen it so many times. There's a life of just kind of wonder and difficulty and all the stuff that's in that, but it all goes together. So you got to show up. So these are the two pieces, all finished, all ready to go. Where we go from here is we do some light sanding, clean all the little edges up and everything, get them bisque fired, and then they'll be in the November wood fire. So I'll post these online once they come out. So if you're interested, you can see them finished. It's really been fun doing this video. Doing these little short videos over a period of time, and hopefully you got something out of it. It's been fun for me. It's been fun to explore kind of a different opening for this and a different top. It's an idea I'll kind of try to push over the next few pieces. This is something that would take maybe a dozen forms to kind of really try to figure out for me. So I'll do that. So that'll be kind of winter work. I always like when I'm doing a workshop situation where I'll try a little tweak on something, and then that opens the door for when I come back to my studio to explore that little tweak I did. And this little exercise, this video workshop for the Huntington has kind of opened that door for me for these pieces. So I appreciate that, and we'll just see where this goes. Anyway, I hope you all got something out of this. It's been really a hoot to do it. Wish we could have been together in West Virginia, but we couldn't. So we did this instead, and I actually think it worked out really great. So it's been a pleasure to do it, and thanks for being part of all this with us. And thank you to the Huntington for all you did to make this possible.